Hello, friends. What day is today? Well, it's Wednesday, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to watch it today. Or that'll even get this uploaded. So, today's actually not even Wednesday, it's Thursday. That's the kind of week it's been. Oh, well. Let's see. I want to talk about kind of a controversial topic today. Or at least I view it that way. And I'm going to preface what I say as we go through this, or as I go through this, with the disclaimer and reminder that everything I say is, of course, filtered through my own experience and my own practice and my own flaws and strengths. And my experience, like everyone else's, is and is not limited. So this is by way of broaching an interesting, I hope, and slightly maybe controversial topic, which is about making tarot better and making our readings better, assuming that you think that they need to be made better. I have, I think, talked about before, one of my goals for this year, for 2017, is to make my readings more useful, to make them more practical, practical in the literal sense of the word, meaning that they are practicable. They are something that can be taken and used and practiced with, and less esoteric and less poetic, I guess. Not to take the magic or the drama or the art out of the process, but to make sure that what comes out of the readings that I do for others and for myself is that they be useful in a way that I have found in my experience. Our readings can sometimes drift away from. And again, I've had readings from others. I've done readings. One of the things that I've noticed is that the style of reading that I developed came from the readings that I had, the reading that I did in books, and just, to a certain degree, like fumbling in the dark. Sarah McLachlan has that album called Fumbling Towards Ecstasy, which is it's a really lovely metaphor for what you're doing when you're out there on your own trying to figure things out. You're just sort of stumbling along and trying to get to this closeness to divinity, closeness to where we want to go. So and so out of that, I developed a very poetic style, I think, especially because almost all of my early readings were written. And I don't know, I don't know that sometimes the readings that I have had from others, and it's limited, it's a small group of people out there in the world that I've allowed to read for me. And the readings that I have done for others sometimes focus more on kind of the impressiveness of seeing what's hard to see, and less on being about being useful, to just go back to that word. So I will continue this reverie momentarily, but I want to, in the first 5 minutes of this video, actually state my thesis, right? So here, follow me for a few minutes, if you will. Let's do a little visual aid. I made some visual aids today at work. So we all have those friends who are constantly in a state of crisis. Tell me if this sounds familiar. And they come to you and they share that crisis with you. They share their latest drama. And because you are an empathetic human being, you give them your best, most well-reasoned advice. And it's good advice. And likely, if they followed that advice, they would solve their problem, or at least begin to claw their way out of the dark that they find themselves in, out of the drama that they find themselves in. Except they don't take your advice. And time after time, they come to you. You give them the advice that they're asking for or seem to be asking for, and then they immediately go out and do exactly what they were going to do anyway, which is usually probably 99% of the time not the thing that you suggested doing. People, by and large, don't take advice. And even if we're good at giving it, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're qualified to. Sometimes, I think, sort of in my experience talking to counselors, they'll tell you that people, when they're complaining to friends and looking for advice, are really looking to be heard. But it's very difficult for us as caring human beings to not offer some aid, right? Because that's what we do. We're trained from birth probably to help others. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to take the help we offer. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to trust us. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be useful or etc. I think over time, I have learned that tarot readings are much the same. In essence, folks are coming to us in a state, not necessarily of crisis, but in a state of wanting to know more, or needing to know more, or wanting to explore. And in my case, my desire to help immediately gets triggered. So here's where I start to touch on the kind of readers we are, because this may not be something that affects you. Whoops, whoa. In this book, which I've talked about before, I think it was in my favorite tarot books video, by Christine Jetty. Again, I always hope I'm pronouncing that right, called Professional Tarot. This is a book I really like. It's a little dated, but it's still really good. And the parts that are dated are minor compared to the rest of it. In it, she sort of talks, and I've seen other books do this too, but this is the one I remember. She goes through and talks about the kind of reader you might be. And she categorizes them as the teacher, the interpreter, the healer, the mystic. Is that the only other type? And the alchemist. And she says if you're going to start reading for others, especially professionally, it's worth knowing what kind of reader you are, and likely you're a combination of the bunch. But the reason that I'm talking about this even, and the reason that it's on my mind, is because I am of the group that is sort of the teacher and the healer. I'm in that category. And why that matters is because when folks come to me for help, I want to help them. But the question becomes, am I qualified in some cases? Or, am I just Lucy at her little booth dispensing advice that isn't really within her scope of experience, and are they Charlie Brown, who is just going to do the Charlie Browniest thing on their own? Hopefully this is following. I actually made notes because this is such a big topic I wanted to get out. So my point ultimately is that my instinct as a reader is to want to give advice, help, to give them the answer, to show them the way, right? To be a guru, to kind of teach them the answer. That frequently is not necessarily the best approach in my experience, even though it's my instinct, because A, I'm not necessarily qualified to give them the best advice. B, I'm not living their life. And all I know, unless they're close to me, is what I'm seeing in the reading. And if they are close to me, chances are I don't need a reading to see what I'm seeing in the cards. And frequently when friends talk to me about readings, especially ones that I'm close to and that I see a lot, I will tell them, nothing I say here may surprise you, because we know each other well enough that I may not need a tarot reading to kind of tell you what I see. And also, it's impossible for me to not filter that reading through my experience with you. So, A, I'm not qualified necessarily. B, I don't know their life. And C, they may not necessarily want advice. Or they may want advice, but they're not going to follow it. Or they're maybe going to follow it, but kind of. You know what I mean? Controversial topic, right? Because this is a big, complicated thing. So, as I have been pondering this innate piece of being human, and the efficacy of readings, and how likely is it, if I give advice in a reading, that it will be followed, and what right do I as a reader have to expect that it should be followed, and what authorizes me to know what the best thing to do is in someone else's life. Big questions, right? And yet, I'm still offering readings. People are still occasionally coming for them, and there's a contract there to be useful or to provide a service, and I think that service should be useful. So here is where my corporate life comes into play, and here's what I have been thinking about, and one of the things that's going to be a path for me this year. I've talked a little bit about my creative life as a writer. You obviously know my tarot life because I post videos about it. And then there's this third branch of my life that's my corporate life. And I work as an instructional designer and a leader of instructional designers for a large corporation. And my job is to create learning events or to help others create learning events. And part of what I do is I write and lead leadership, what we call leadership development training, which is essentially how to be a better leader, how to lead teams, how to work with people, how to improve performance. So when I'm not writing training or delivering training events, I'm researching what the training events should be. Because again, I'm not necessarily, I don't come from a background of being an expert in management. I am a learning design expert. I know adult learning theory. And expert, I guess I could use that term expert loosely, right? That's my field in my corporate world. I know I know enough about adult learning theory to make me an infectious and effective learning designer. And I qualify the way I am because, of course, there are people who have master's degrees in this and spend their lives. I am an instructional designer. I take the genius research and work that others have done and learn enough about it to know how people learn. One of the things that I have discovered in my research for writing leadership development training is how people learn, as I said, how people retain information, and how to coach others, how to improve performance, how to improve, and even as I'm saying this, I'm stopping because it's sort of misleading, because what I've actually discovered is that if you're leading a team, your job is not to improve performance. Your job is to empower others to improve their performance. And so that's where the thread that I picked up at the very beginning, and that's where the threads start to come through, right? So the job of a coach in an office of a supervisor of a team, a manager of a team, is to empower that team to do their best work. I have started to think in terms of being a tarot reader in that same vein. That my job as a reader is to do what I can from my limited experience to provide an experience that empowers the querent to do their best work, whatever that, quote, work is, whether it is literal work, whether it's their development of their self, the development of their whatever, their relationships, which is frequently what we're talking about when we're reading for others. So the goal of the tarot reader in my evolution has become more like a coach in a corporate environment. And hence the journey that we're going to talk about right now. So in my research for a leadership development training that I recently worked on in 2016, my boss and I we were almost done writing the training. I had gone through all the research, done all the da-da-da-da-das, and the day before we were all leaving, my boss and my peer, to deliver this training I had spent the last 6 months writing, my boss FedExed me this book and said, read this, it's going to change the way you think. And it changed the way I think so much that we actually rewrote the training in the days before, the 2 days before we were supposed to deliver it, because what this book taught us was so powerful. And I'm going to highlight a few key things from this book. And I recommend the book just as an interesting book for anyone who's in the field of coaching others, because it's really smart. It's called Successful Coaching in a Week. This is a book from the UK. It's not consistently easy to get in the United States, although I believe now there is a version that's been published in the US that's a little bit different. I don't super love the changes they made, but they're not dramatic. It's by Matt Somers, Somers. It has a different cover in the US version, but this one is available. This we got on Amazon. It's just like sometimes it's on Amazon and it's like $50. But don't buy that because there are editions, copies of this that are new and available, and it should be closer to like $12. But it's out there, and there isn't an American version now. But in this book, what Matt Somers' goal is to teach people how to empower others. And he uses this brilliant coaching metaphor that I had never before heard, and it completely changed the way I think about what I do at work and the leadership training I write at work. And also in the past year, what a great reading could do. So what he does is he's talking about what is the difference between coaching and teaching, which is related and not. But what he says is that a great coach, let me see if I can find the quote here. I have so many notes and things written here, but our role is to probe and encourage and help the coachee, the person being coached, make sense of things for him or herself. Then he tells this great story. This can be a difficult concept to grasp, and a comparison is useful here. When we get up in the morning, we usually pad across the hallway to the bathroom and begin the mammoth task of making ourselves look presentable. For some, this may mean dragging a razor across their face and a comb through their hair, while others may concentrate on applying makeup and hairspray. All of these activities would be almost impossible without our trusty friend in the bathroom mirror. And then here's where his analogy really becomes powerful. But does the mirror say, oh, I wouldn't do it like that, or that's not how we usually shave, or you've never done your hair like that before? Of course not. Nevertheless, the mirror does help us make sense of what is going on and achieve our aim, which is in this case to look presentable before we face the world. When we are coaching, we are trying to perform the same function. The best coaches will hold up a mirror so that people can develop a deep self-awareness, a deep sense of self-awareness. When people are highly self-aware, they have more choices about how to move issues forward. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. And that to me is what a tarot reading is. A tarot reading becomes a mirror. Our job as a reader is to look at the cards and do our best to reflect back to the person we're reading for the situation they're asking us about, without doing too much to influence their results. There's a couple more quotes that I thought were useful that I want to just look at and see if they apply here or later. Yeah, actually. So he goes on to talk about perception. The idea of perception and interpretation, which again, I think when we're talking about this in the corporate world, we're frequently talking about data. You know, the data is your performance. The data is how many sales you made, how long it took you to do that. In tarot, the data is the spread. You know, the data is the information that we're seeing before us. The most important thing to recognize as we coach people through this stage is that we call reality is all a matter of perception. And what we're doing is trying to present the information here in as neutral a way as we can. The person that we're reading for perceives it and filters it through their life experience. And it's important that we allow that to happen, because it's that person. He says in here, when it comes to coaching, the important perspective in coaching is that of the person being coached. It's their vision of reality that counts. It's dangerous to impose our view of reality on the other person. We need to be alive to the possibility of different perceptions and perspectives, because of course we don't know, everything that's going on in their lives. So their perception of the events is what matters, even if the perception that we're seeing in the reading tells us something else. This gets very convoluted, so I'm trying to measure myself so that I'm clear. But do you see where I'm going? we can't bully the querent into seeing what we see. We can't bully them into doing the things that the reading suggests. We can't even necessarily make them believe that what the reading suggests is the right way to go. What we can do is reflect and be a mirror. The example that I have been using when I facilitate this learning at work is social media and politics, and the reality of how we respond to people who disagree with us. No mind, I don't think, has ever been changed by a nasty Facebook post pointing out how stupid someone is for thinking what they think or voting for what they voted for. Now, that doesn't stop me from blasting my opinion all over the place, but the reality is I'm probably not changing minds. In fact, what I'm probably doing is pushing the other person, the person who disagrees with me, deeper into their conviction that they're right. There was a really interesting piece in the New Yorker. If I can find it and remember, I'll link it below just because it's interesting. But there was an interesting piece in the New Yorker recently about how facts don't change minds because of confirmation bias, essentially. And it goes on to talk about some Stanford experiments. Stanford, of course, is famous for the Stanford Prison Experiment, but there are others that they did about convincing people and changing minds. It's either in the Christine Jetty book I was just looking at, or in another of her books, and I think it might be in her Tower for the Healing Heart book. I believe it's her, it could be Janina Renee, but I'm 99% it's Christine Jetty. She talks about how, and in fact, I may have even bookmarked it here. Anyway, she talks about how people in crisis or people in a state frequently can't see the reality of it because they have built up a protective shell around themselves so that they can only see certain things. They can't see the reality, or they can't see the objectiveness of it, because if they were to actually break that wall, to break that shell, it would shatter their perception of self. I can't find it, and I don't want to waste your time more than I already am, but you get my point, right? That people frequently can't see more than they're willing to because it would destroy their ability to survive in the world. Like the brand that we present ourselves, of ourselves, is carefully constructed, not only so that people think a certain way about ourselves, but so that we think a certain way about ourselves. I mean, only through therapy for years have I learned that my brand is based largely on apologizing for, I've already done it once or twice on this video, apologizing for taking up your time, because part of my brand is to be nice and to be liked, and also to preemptively stop you from judging me, so that if I apologize for rambling or not being clear or going on too long, you can't point that out and be upset with me because I've already preempted you in doing that. It's the same reason I make fun of myself so much. That's part of my brand. It took therapy to see that objectively and look at it and work with it rather than against it, or even be able to notice that it was there. When I was 20 years old, that would have been a very different story. And if you had told me that, I wouldn't have been able to accept it, or I would have fought it, or it would have kind of shattered at least my relationship with you. So there do you see like how big this is? There's that strand of it that the perception matters, the perception, and we can't bully people into changing their perception. What we can do is reflect. What we can do, as he says, Matt Sommer says in the book, is create self-awareness, and at least create the opportunity for it. Because self-awareness, it's like the old G.I. Joe commercials from the 80s, like knowing is half the battle. To change anything and to improve our lives in any way, being self-aware matters. he says here, the coach is not concerned with answers, but with giving people an opportunity to think with greater clarity so that they can formulate solutions or ideas that will work for them. And then another thing that he talks about, which I think is important, and again, he's talking about managers or leaders of teams, but we could substitute the word reader for managers in this. He says insecure managers will often get a sense of satisfaction from rescuing other people. It makes them feel good because they have helped someone out, and they believe that the other person will feel good because they have passed their dilemma on to somebody else. When we take responsibility for someone else's situation, we have failed to develop that person, and we have simply reinforced their sense of dependence. So what we don't do if we take on someone else's problem or we try to solve the problems for them, what we don't do is empower them or reflect or really even benefit them. We just create a sense of dependence, which I guess is a good thing to do if you're trying to create a source of income, but not necessarily a great thing to do if you're trying to help people. So this all came from a lot of it just came from experience, but a lot of it came from Successful Coaching in a Week by Matt Summers, which I really recommend just if you're interested at all in coaching others. But if you have a team at work, if you are a reader, I think there's a lot to be explored in what we do. So then I present to you, you come to me in your crisis, and I try not to be a therapist, but I instead try to be a mirror. And I just say, here's what I see. Go forth and live your life. Is that helpful? Maybe. I mean, I may say something that unlocks a key for you. But the other thing that may be worth considering is another piece of the coaching puzzle, which doesn't come from that book, I don't think, but does come from the world of coaching, which is sort of a two-part thing. One is questions. Providing the person that we're reading for with questions to think about can go a long way. And in coaching, we talk about open-ended questions. Questions, for example, that you might use after reflecting. I'm going to keep using my visual aids because I'm very proud of them. After reflecting, asking open-ended questions. For anyone who doesn't know, an open-ended question is a question that can't be answered yes or no. So these are questions that are what, how, who, and as you're working on this, if you decide to follow this path that I'm attempting to take, it's important to be aware of like the hidden open-ended question, which is like it starts with an open-ended beginning. I'm trying to think of an example right now, and I only really notice them when I hear people do it or when I notice that I've done it. But it's like, I can't think of one. Just like go back and look at your question and say, or even this, if they answer with a yes or no, you didn't ask an open-ended question. But open-ended questions you might think about are, how does this connect to your current situation? Where do these concepts, where do these energies appear in your situation or in your life? What does the energy I just described prompt in you? Do you see what I'm saying? So, and if you're doing this face to face, there can be dialogue there. If you're dialoguing, the key is to be neutral. The key is to ask more questions, not confirm or deny the appropriateness of the other person's answer, but to allow them to wrestle with the question and then prompt them with more questions. And it's not an interrogation, so I wouldn't go too far. But you know, when you're dealing with people, you get a sense of how things are going, and that takes practice and time. But, this is especially useful, I think, when you do a reading for somebody and they're not actually connecting the dots, and the cards that you've drawn they're looking at you like you have 5 heads. You reflect to them the Knight of Wands, suggesting an energy in their life of wanting to go out and seek really exciting times. Go out, it's a young man. You say, I see a young man who's going out there and wanting to just like sow his wild oats and sleep with as many people as possible and experience everything he can experience and not have to worry about his feelings and not have to worry about thinking too much and not have to worry about being practical, but to just be, and you reflect that, and they say, oh. Then the conversation goes from, oh, maybe I'm wrong, panic attack, to how might this appear in your life? How might this connect to anything you're experiencing? How might you be manifesting this? Where in your life do people manifest this? Who in your life might be acting that way? Do you see what I mean? So then, again, you're not qualifying the accuracy of the Knight of Wands in the reading. You've seen a reflection, you've reflected it back, and then you ask questions, open-ended questions, to help the person connect the dots. They may not be able to connect the dots while they're sitting there with you, and that's okay. These are the kinds of things that you say, as a therapist might, and we have to be very careful not to be therapists, because we're not, unless we are trained and qualified therapists. But a therapist might say, I'm going to leave you with this thought. Let me leave you with these questions. How might this reckless, sexy, passionate, frivolous is a word I'm reaching for, so I'll use it, frivolous energy be affecting your life right now? It may take a few days, and maybe they'll never connect the dots. I don't know. But asking the question makes it very difficult to forget the question. Whereas if I tell you, well, obviously this has to do with your unhappiness in your relationship and the fact that you want to go out and bang everyone you meet. You know what I mean? That I could say that. It's probably going to be insulting. I'd probably be more diplomatic than that anyway. But it will be more effective, and their self-awareness will be raised more. They'll be more empowered to do something with that energy if driving home or laying in bed tonight or 3 days from now in the shower, oh God, like I've been totally that guy, for example. Do you know what I mean? So don't feel pressured in the dialogue, if you are face to face, to answer your own questions. Be okay with silence. If you've asked a good question, it's okay to give them permission to not have the answer right away, but it's not okay for you to answer it for them. So give them permission to think about it. Give them permission to live with it. In fact, encourage them to do it. In fact, if they know the answer right out of the gate, there's a chance it may not necessarily be an accurate reflection. Who knows? But don't answer the question for them. That's their job. So that's part 1. Or really part 1 and 2. Part 1 is reflect. Part 2 is ask. And then part 3 is to suggest, in the way that we do when we're coaching, action. Now, our job is not to suggest the actions to take, but rather the idea of an action plan. So action 1 might be to live with these questions. Action 2 might be to then figure out how the energy that we talked about, once you figure out how they're the hows and the whys and all of those who, what, when, where questions, how that's impacting your situation for good or ill, and then what you might do about it. So in essence, you're leaving them with more questions, but they can create an action plan by wrestling in essence with the reflection, by looking at themselves in the mirror and saying, I don't like that haircut. My job as a reader is to say, this card says, your hair is 3 inches longer than it was last month. Oh, I don't like that look on me. Well, why is that affecting you? How could you be affected by that? And then what might you do about it? Well, I could cut my hair, or I could try a different style. That's them. I'm pointing, this is just a weird example, right? But I'm going back to the mirror. So suggesting to them that you that they wrestle with the questions, and that they then, when they know the answers to those questions, come up with an action plan that will help them progress. And so if this is a real life dialogue, if you're engaged in a conversation and sitting across from you, all of this can happen. If it's a video like I do or a written reading, then your reading can end with the questions and then a suggestion of, once you have these, here are some ways you could build an action plan for yourself. And an action plan is just a series of performable, measurable tasks that you agree to do. So I'm going to agree to see my barber next month. I'm going to agree to embrace this sexy time in my life, but accept that I need to end my relationship to do it. Or I'm going to combat this desire to go out and sleep with everybody and commit to my relationship. That's them. But we suggest the action plan with being performable, measurable things. And that's a very corporate term too, performable, measurable. But performable simply means it's something that's active, it's something that's doable. And measurable means you can figure out how well you've done it. Because there's a tendency when people make commitments to themselves to make passive commitments. And a passive commitment is like, I'm going to understand that about myself. Well, what's that mean and how do you know you're doing it? Rather, I'm going to stop beating myself up. That's something you can actively do or not do. Understanding is passive. Knowing is passive. Stopping, going, making, taking, moving, those are active. So there is my long rambly view of how adult learning theory and how coaching theory can potentially make readings more practical. And this is going to be my attempt as I work through 2017 to do it. So just to recap very quickly what I said at the beginning, which I probably could have done just to start with. When people come to us, we have to think of them like the friend who we always give advice to who doesn't want our advice. And also consider whether or not we're capable of actually giving it in certain cases. The best thing that we can do is lay out the cards and as best as possible and as neutrally as possible, reflect back to them the situation as it is objectively. Then, rather than telling them what they could or should do, ask them open-ended questions that can prompt them to connect the dots between the reflection and what they're feeling, struggling with, experiencing, etc. And giving them permission not to know the answers right away, but to live with them and wrestle with them for a while. And then once they know the answers to those questions, come up with an action plan for how they're going to change it. But again, the action plan is theirs. What we can do is suggest and ask questions, and suggest that I should rephrase that. Let me start again. What we can do is ask questions and suggest the action plan. We can tell them how an action plan can be effective by creating performable, measurable objectives or tasks for ourselves that we can commit to and avoiding passive things that are hard to know if we're progressing on. And that's that. So we can embrace the idea of being a coach, embrace the idea of being a mirror, embrace the idea of asking questions, and then letting that be the impetus for them to explore. So this is a path that I'm working on. I hope this is interesting for you. It's kind of hard to demonstrate. And because most of my readings are going to be online or online on video for the most part, what I may do is ask the questions at the end of the video. And in the email where I follow up and say, here's your video reading, ask the questions again, and then include like an action plan worksheet that includes questions and suggestions for creating an action plan. So, here are some things you could do. Here are some questions you could ask yourself. Here's how you create great action plans for yourself, and making commitments to yourself, etc. But then that's theirs to work with. It's not me. I'm not the therapist. I'm not the boss. I'm just asking questions and reflecting information. So that is what I'm working on right now, and I hope it's interesting for you, and I hope you're doing well. It's almost springtime, and that's a nice thing. And by the way, I pulled out this deck because I thought I might use it, but I'm loving, if you're participating in March of the Pips on Instagram, I'm loving this whole thing, and you should participate. I found this a very freeing thing to work on, and something that's been also actually very interesting for helping me think more practically and more usefully about reading. So go do that now. See, this is me telling you what to do, right? That's not what I'm supposed to do. How would it feel if you participated in March of the Pips? All right. Have a good night.